Hello, this is Trevor Harrison, welcoming you to the fourth lecture in Political Sociology, Sociology 3360 for Spring 2020. In this lecture, I will cover civil society and politics, specifically looking at the ideas of structural functionalist theorists, beginning with Auguste Comte and Emile Durkheim, and moving up to more contemporary theorists. As you read the text and take in this lecture, you will see that the ideas of structural functionalists are generally at variance with the ideas of Marx and Weber, who are often termed conflict theorists. At the same time, I will draw your attention at points to similarities that may not at first be apparent. This lecture will generally follow the outline shown in PowerPoint 2. I encourage you to pour yourself a coffee or any other beverage of your choosing and get ready at your convenience to take in the lecture. In previous lectures, I began with a biography of the two main figures discussed, Marx and Weber. This time, however, as shown in slide number 3, I am going to begin with a discussion of some major ideas that shaped not only sociology, but the social sciences more generally in the 19th century, as this discussion will help frame some essential differences between conflict and structural functional approaches. By the late 18th century, if not before, it was obvious to people in Europe that things were changing. New technologies, the expansion of trade, urbanization, these things and others were resulting in new ideas, classes, and roles, many of them both literally and figuratively revolutionary in nature. In one way or another, the major thinkers of the late 18th and 19th centuries dealt with the changes that were occurring and the type of society that was emerging. The terms of comparison differed from a traditional to a modern society, from a feudal to a capitalist society, or from a society, as Emile Durkheim described, based on mechanical solidarity, to one marked by organic solidarity. But the basic idea remains the same. Some scholars were particularly interested in the process of change. What were the causes of change? For Marx, it was class conflict. These theorists were primarily interested in the dynamics, the causal forces behind change. Another group of theorists, akin to Heraclitus' observation that a river flows yet remains the same, were interested in the constants that mark society, the static nature of human society, what makes society stable. For these theorists, the idea of change was at least partly an illusion. On the surface, things might seem to change, but new technologies do not change the essential characteristics of human behavior or the need to have certain functions performed. Family structures may change, but there is still something like a family that raises, nurtures, and takes care of children. We may develop formal education systems, schools, but the function of training children to become adults does not change. The dynamics versus statics debate was an essential debate of the 19th century and remains a differentiating element of conflict versus structural functionalist thought. Slide number 4 presents the contrasting elements of conflict versus structural functionalist models, as described many years ago by a British sociologist, Ralph, later Sir Ralph, Dahrendorf. The essence of the structural functional model is that things are relatively unchanging, or at least change very slowly. By contrast, the conflict model suggests that change is constant. While structural functionalists argue the idea of change is illusory, conflict theorists argue the idea of stability and persistence is the real illusion. Number 4 in the comparison is a particularly important difference. Where structural functionalists emphasize the widespread agreement or consensus among people for the kind of society that exists, conflict theorists emphasize the role of constraint or coercion and force at the heart of society? Is there widespread agreement that CEOs in Canada should receive 239 times more money on average than working Canadians, as recently reported? Or is compliance based on legal, rational mechanisms of coercion and indeed economic threat? Slide 5 deals with Auguste Comte, known as the father of sociology. I won't provide you with a full biography here, but his writings were essential to the early founding of sociology. Two ideas stand out. The first is that society could be examined objectively in a scientific manner, that facts could be adduced and a better society planned. Comte's ideas are commensurate with empiricism, but are at odds with other fields of sociology, as you are probably very quickly aware, such as symbolic interaction and later postmodern approaches, as well as psychoanalytic approaches that see facts as not neutral and understandings as largely socially constructed. Comte's second idea situates sociology as having a unique task in modern society. Society was, according to Comte, the last of the sciences to emerge, the queen of the sciences, whose task would be to assemble the knowledge acquired by other disciplines. Sociology would be at the heart of a new secular humanist religion, sociologists themselves the kind of priesthood. Comte's major influence lies in the idea that society can be studied objectively and facts determined that will lead to a better society. His ideas were highly influential, most especially upon a French scholar, Emile Durkheim. Emile Durkheim was a French sociologist, indeed the first professor of sociology. Trained as an anthropologist, the two fields were very close until quite recently, and even today there are merged sociology and anthropology departments at many universities. Much of Durkheim's work took from field studies of so-called primitive societies. This background aligned with comparisons between traditional societies and modern ones. Durkheim believed that by studying simpler forms of society, one could get a better understanding of the essential elements and characteristics making up more complex modern societies. Slide number 6 lists several of Durkheim's books. Each of these is important to understanding Durkheim's sociology, so I'll say something about each. The division of labor in society highlights two types of society held together by different forms of solidarity. In simple societies, mechanical solidarity is the primary form. In such societies, there's little difference between people. Their thinking habits are basically very similar. The major factors differentiating people's status are age and gender. But even then, there's widespread agreement about essential values, and thus people tend to think and act alike. They do so automatically based on tradition and habit. Solidarity in simple societies is a product of sameness. If one wants an analogous expression, think birds of a feather flock together. In more complex societies, organic solidarity is the primary form. The term organic plays off of the notion of society being like the human body that possesses a number of organs, each of which performs specific functions. An amoeba is a simple life form with few differentiating body parts. Not so, however, the human body. But the human body is only healthy if all of its organs function well together. Each organ, the brain, heart, liver, etc., contributes to the overall health of the body. The individual parts are interdependent. All the parts of society must function in concert, in harmony, if human society is to thrive. Where mechanical solidarity is based on sameness, organic solidarity is based on specialization and interdependence. If again one wants an analogous expression, think opposites attract. One last point on the division of labor in society. Durkheim warns of the dangers of excess individualism, a point he returns to in Suicide. Individualism works against cooperation and harmony. Conflict for Durkheim and other structural functionalists is not usual, as it was for Marx, but a temporary aberration, an illness in the system that must be remedied. The rules of sociological method echoes Comte's ideas of empirical research, that all things can be studied objectively and scientifically, and therefore known. The book can be considered the first methods textbook in sociology. Suicide is the application of scientific method to the study of suicide. It is a highly readable text. I would very much recommend it to you. Clear in its discussion, taking the reader systematically through Durkheim's arguments. Durkheim deciphers 4 types of suicide: altruistic, egoistic, anomic, and in a footnote that is small but should be read, fatalistic. As some have suggested, these 4 types can actually be reduced to 2, however. In one type, suicide is the product of the individual being too absorbed in society, the altruistic and fatalistic types. The example of Japanese kamikaze pilots is often used in this regard. In the other type, suicide is the product of the individual being insufficiently integrated into society. The egoistic and anomic types, anomy meaning normlessness, where people simply don't know what the prevailing norms of behavior are the types associated with this. People who are socially isolated, lonely, and depressed are good examples of people suffering from either egoistic or anomic behavior. Durkheim's work on suicide, especially of the latter type, holds up well even today. Crisis centers employing checklists for risk assessment use such questions as, is the individual employed or has become recently unemployed? Are they married or in a close relationship, or have those relationships recently broken up? Has the individual recently lost a loved one? Have they recently moved? All of these questions addressed to the individual point to the importance of social bonding. Are people connected with the wider society? Those bonded more closely into society are at less risk for suicide. Politically, the issue of bonding is an important one in collective action, political action. People who bond together might become a political force. By contrast, those who remain outside the collective might be more prone to anarchistic, even nihilistic, or lone wolf kinds of actions. The elementary forms of religious life points once again to the idea that the same functions appear in all human societies, but that they are more easily examined and understood in simple societies. Durkheim was ideologically a liberal of the 19th century variety. Moral education outlines the importance of widespread public education, including sex education, as important to creating a good society. But like many liberals of the 19th and centuries afterwards, the importance of education to good politics, to democracy, is also at the fore of his ideas. Slide number 7 reiterates several of Durkheim's key political ideas, with the addition of one that is laid out in the division of labor in society. For Durkheim, both society and the state are abstract, if important, concepts. Durkheim's central concern was that people feel bonded, integrated into the community. How is this possible as society grew and as people became increasingly differentiated from each other through the labor market? For example, occupying different occupations and jobs. His answer was through intermediate associations, such as labor unions or professional associations, to which we might add community groups, religious organizations, political parties, etc. These groups, through their interactions with individuals, bring them into the broader, more abstract entity known as society. Slide number 8 adds several other points central to Durkheim's ideas. Like all structural functionalists, Durkheim is concerned with the power of norms, including laws, to guide behavior. He is not a materialist, as was Marx, but he also notes the unconscious manner in which we are influenced. We do not stop to think about why we are doing something. Instead, we follow rules of behavior, of action, based on a series of rituals and symbols that lead us in our behavior. A good example here is how a piece of cloth gains an unconscious meaning in the instance that it becomes a flag. It is the unconscious way that we act that leads Durkheim to speak of social facts, manners of behavior that can only be understood objectively, observed in the consequences, and not on the basis of what people tell you about why they do something. Suicide is the prime example of a social fact. The individual who attempts suicide may have several personal explanations for his or her behavior, but it gains a greater level of explanation when seen as part of a common pattern in which many individuals sharing the same social characteristics act in the same manner. Consider voting as another example. Political parties today spend a huge amount of time and effort slicing and dicing the characteristics of their supporters by age, gender, education, income, marital status, etc. They do so because these variables are meaningful indicators. The individual supporter may provide numerous reasons for their choice of either party A or party B. But the general pattern of behavior across individuals suggests that something deeper, unconscious, is motivating their choice. Slide number 9 shows Alexis de Tocqueville. Tocqueville is not categorically a structural functionalist, but his ideas fit into that camp. He visited North America in the 1830s to study penal reforms, but came away writing instead a work of profound influence, Democracy in America. Democracy in America has been reissued only in the last few years and remains a topic of discussion among political scientists and political sociologists. Tocqueville was particularly struck, as were many Europeans of the period. Much of Europe was still very feudal, authoritarian, and undemocratic, by the widespread democratic impulse of American society. He attributed this democratic impulse to two things: fairly widespread suffrage at the time compared to elsewhere, though slavery still existed and women didn't have the vote, and general economic equality, again noting the exceptions. He believed that these two things, suffrage and equality, were the result of political freedom and the large number of voluntary associations that he saw throughout America's small communities. Tocqueville was writing before Durkheim, but the importance of intermediate, localized groups bringing people together into society is similar to what Durkheim wrote about in The Division of Labor in Society. But Tocqueville also issued warnings for American democracy that still resonate. First, he noted presciently the problem of race, which would lead 26 years later to the Civil War, which remains a guiding element in American politics. Second, he also noted that the basic equality underpinning American democracy was already eroding. The differences in wealth were emerging as the US became more industrialized. Within decades, America was already on the way of becoming what has been termed today not a democracy, but an oligarchy. Third, Tocqueville also noted the threat of majoritarianism, where the majority might run roughshod over minority rights, a phenomenon seen regularly, including today, in the form of American populism. Slide number 10 deals with Robert Merton, one of the 20th century's greatest and most influential sociologists. Like other structural functionalists, Merton was interested in how the parts of society function together, but he was also something of a radical in his thinking. While mainstream structural functionalists took it for granted that things functioned as they should, that is optimally, and hence why would you change anything, Merton noted that patterns of behavior could also be dysfunctional in their outcomes. Human beings might act in a totally rational and functional manner to achieve certain rational ends that at the same time could lead to non-functionally useful things for society, in fact, quite harmful things. Stealing in certain situations is a rational act. It is also a self-interested act. Dumping toxic waste in the water supply might be totally rational, cost-effective, in fact, for a company to do, but it's socially and environmentally, I think we would all agree here, a bad thing. Like Weber, Merton points out that the unanticipated consequences arising from human action can lead to things that we did not begin to plan in a rational sense, as Comte had hoped. He also notes that actions may have a both obvious, that is manifest, and unintended or unrecognized, that is latent function. Consider education, for example. Education is manifestly about training people on what they need to know, but its latent function is to socialize and discipline them for work and to make sure they are not causing problems. Public schools were begun in the 19th century, often to keep unsupervised children off the streets of the growing urban centers. This is actually the beginnings of public education. The criminal justice system seems to be about dealing with people who commit crimes, as another example, but we have seen in lecture 3, it also seems to be a very efficient means of enlarging private profits. Building on Durkheim, neo-structural functionalists are particularly interested in the elements that link people to their broader society. The term neo-consensualists in slide number 11 expresses the idea that society is a product to a large degree of consent and consensus as to how things should be done. Seymour Martin Lipset, discussed in the book, was a major sociologist of the 20th century with a particular interest in Canada. He remained fond of and speaking about Canada until his death. He wrote his doctoral thesis, later an excellent book on the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation. It later became the NDP. The CCF was a prairie populist party built out of a farmer-worker coalition. In 1944, it was elected in Saskatchewan, where it remained in office for the next 20 years, the first socialist government ever elected in North America. Like Durkheim, Lipset argued that society is held together by middle-range civil institutions that integrate people into their society. The farmers' cooperatives, again, were a major part of the political organization of the CCF. Like Tocqueville, Lipset argued that such institutions are also important for the functioning of democracy. The destruction of civil society institutions, he argued, is ultimately harmful to democracy. Slide number 12 ties together several images that connect to the work of Robert Bellah, whose major contribution to sociology was a critical analysis of the manner in which religion, what otherwise might be an intermediate institution in society, has been co-opted in the US by the state and military. The resultant civil religion is one where quasi-religious justifications are used to explain and justify the actions of the American state and also to uphold the basic tenets of capitalism. Slide number 13 highlights certain elements of American civil religion. Short anecdote here might illustrate Bellah's point. couple of weeks after the attacks of 9/11 on New York and the Pentagon in 2001, I flew to Albuquerque, New Mexico for a conference. Tensions were still running very high, as was American nationalism, patriotism, and its desire for revenge. I saw a sign on a billboard that, in my mind, seemed to capture the sacred trinity of American culture. It read, "Support our troops, God bless America, and buy American." The military state, religion, and capitalism all wrapped into one neon sign. This is exactly what Bellow was referring to, but its power comes from the fact that it is understood unconsciously and thus unquestioningly. It is a product of ritual and symbol that bind people together as a community. Slide number 14 links together the work of Tocqueville with two more recent theorists, James Coleman and Robert Putnam, both of whom emphasize the role of social capital, defined by trust and connections, by social networks, in bonding individuals to society. The term social capital perhaps needs some elaboration in comparison with other types of capital. We are familiar by now with finance capital, the thing that Marx was most interested in. It primarily has to do with the ownership of financial resources that are then reinvested to make yet more money. Human capital refers to an individual's skills and training. University and college students, such as yourselves, are in the process of acquiring skills to be invested in a career. Cultural capital, as defined by Bourdieu and others, refers to a knowledge of cultural products, such as including language, that provide individuals with entry into various social networks and groups. Social capital is marked by the number of connections one has in society. The concept of social capital builds on the ideas of such theorists as Tocqueville, Lipset, Coleman, and Putnam, highlighting the role of civil associations in fostering social connection and trust, out of which democratic participation and harmony becomes a result. But Putnam's work heralds a warning as he suggests that there has been a decline in such civil associations. His evocative book title, Bowling Alone, comes from a minor social fact that he came across while studying the changes in civil society institutions in the US over many years. He noted that in its heyday, sometime after the Second World War, bowling and bowling leagues proliferated throughout the US. But in the years after the 1970s, bowling experienced an enormous decline. If people bowl now, it is generally not as part of a team or on a regular basis. It is a socially disconnected act. This might seem like a tiny and incidental thing, but Putnam uses it as a metaphor to argue that the decline of civil associations is a widespread phenomenon. All sorts of community associations today struggle for members. For Putnam, the connecting tissues of social engagement have been increasingly shredded, with consequences for social cohesion and solidarity. The term associated, of course, with Durkheim. American society has become atomized in the pathological manner that Durkheim feared modern society might go. I should add here, however, that Putnam's work on the United States has also been replicated by he and other researchers in other countries in Europe and others around the world, and a similar situation of social isolation, the decline of intermediate associations is also noted in those places. Slide number 15 deals with corporatism. Corporatism has a long history, going back to the late 19th century, and has been expressed as a socially and politically advantageous means of incorporating citizens into the state. Scholars from both the left and right of the political spectrum have advocated it as a model, And Germany today exhibits some aspects of corporatism, as does Sweden. But there are also some very bad examples from the extreme right. Fascism was and is built on a corporatist model. To understand corporatism, it is useful to go back to what Durkheim said about the state and society, that both are too large and abstract for individuals to feel an allegiance to. What is needed are intermediary associations and organizations that will bring people into the larger sphere. These intermediate associations might be organic, that is, built from the ground up by their members. We have examples of this at hand. The Alberta Teachers Association can be said to be a grassroots organization. Co-ops are also of this type. Sweden's form of corporatism is likewise largely organic, as roughly 80% of Swedish workers are part of unions. Such intermediary organizations are not designed by the state, but rather inform the state and wider society of members' interests and views. But the intermediary organizations might also be created by the state for the purposes of controlling the membership and making them feel loyalty to the state. Boy Scouts began as a paramilitary outfit designed to discipline youth. It came about at a time when there was widespread concern that the youth would be led astray. A proper dose of deference to authority drilled into young people at an early age could be quite beneficial. There are other examples far more extreme, however, than Boy Scouts. Far more extreme, Mussolini's brown shirts and Hitler's youth were also designed to discipline and control youth in the interest of the state. If they cannot outright destroy grassroots organizations, authoritarian states tend generally to at least control and threaten them. Slide number 16 brings us to modernization theory, something we discussed briefly a while ago. As you are all aware now, a major tenet of structural functionalism is that all parts of society function together. A change in one part necessitates changes in the other parts. Modernization theory arose in the post-Second World War period as a means of bringing underdeveloped countries up to Western standards, and also not incidentally, to counter the appeal of communism in third world countries during the period of the Cold War. The premise of modernization theory was the need for structural changes that would see traditional societies modernized. Thus, urbanization and industrialism were emphasized over rural life and agriculture, and mass production and mass consumption. A Western-style economy and Western-style democracy were also emphasized. These changes needed to be imposed through coercion, perhaps even a military coup. It was all for the better. The people would be better off in the long run, or so it was argued, bringing to mind John Maynard Keynes' remark that, in the long run, we're all dead. In any case, the promise of modernization proved a failure in most countries where it was imposed. Its practice cannot be entirely separated from neo-colonial efforts to impose foreign control and influence on the underdeveloped world. Talcott Parsons, shown here in the slide number 17, was the preeminent American sociologist for much of the 20th century and an exponent of modernization theory. He worked closely with the US government and the Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA. During the McCarthy era, the witch hunts of the 1950s, he turned in those colleagues whom he suspected might be communist sympathizers. Parsons' influence in American sociology continued well into the 1980s. In fact, the first edition of the Orem textbook that you are holding used considerable time dealing with Parsonian sociology. Since then, the luster on many of Parsons' ideas has faded, but his arguments in favor of structural functionalism remain worth examining because they highlight some essential ideas, the interconnectedness of the functional parts of society. Slide number 18 summarizes Parsons' key ideas. For Parsons, there were four interrelated functions necessary to any society's success: adaptation, goal attainment, integration, and what he termed latency, highlighted in the acronym AGIL, AGIL. The first refers broadly to the economic system. The second to the political system that, again, sets goals and direction for society. The third to institutions that create cohesion. And the fourth to cultural patterns of behavior. This may seem quite technical, and in fact it is. Parsons' form of structural functionalism bears much in common with systems theory, which was dominant in several fields during this period, modeled on early computers and management theories. Systems theory certainly remains very prominent in many disciplines today. We come to the last slide here. Slide number 19 summarizes some of the key elements of structural functionalist models of politics. That the natural social state is cooperation, harmony, and consensus, and that essentially conflict is abnormal and, if anything, very temporary. That modern society is marked by increased interdependence, that institutions are designed to foster this kind of functional interdependence. Because everything is, in fact, interconnected, it's also unclear how change is supposed to occur, an issue that, of course, conflict theorists have no particular problem with. Social institutions, including political parties, act to connect individuals and groups with society. Human beings are motivated by unconscious symbols that have meaning for them. For your continued understanding of what has been talked about here, I have also included on slide 19 a YouTube website where you can go and see a short video dealing with structural functionalist theory. I think you'll find it of some interest. In the meantime, I hope you've enjoyed this lecture, and I look forward to speaking to you again in the near future.